Artist Journal, August 6th, 2020. My name is Adrian Pocobelli. I am the artist of the Artist Journal, and I welcome you to this podcast. I have a very special treat for you today as I open this thing up. We have Brian Cotts, another person you've never heard of before. Another great mind. We had Yuki last week, Yuki Nishimura on neoliberalism, and that was a very interesting episode, and we've got something very special to follow it up with. I've known Brian since I was pretty much like 12 years old, and we met in a comic store, 8th Street Books and Comics, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, in the middle of Canada, and yeah, the rest is history, really. Brian was a huge influence on me. We both frequented 8th Street Books, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with used book culture, but it is a very particular culture, and it's kind of a series of intellectual misfits. You know, I mean, because at the end of the day, people revolve around books, and I remember there was this former hippie, or he's a hippie guy, Mike, who had a really interesting life, and he was a real hippie, and I think he spent most of his life in Vancouver and then came to Saskatoon. And Mike passed away maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but he was a fountain of information. He was a reservoir of information, and he really couldn't wait to tell you about it. He had his own little misfit characters, you know, like it was really hard to leave the store when Mike was working because he literally wouldn't let you leave because he would just keep talking, and you actually kind of had to be rude in order to stop and to leave. You had to say, Mike, I have to go. I have to go. I just have to go. This is really interesting, but I have to go. So anyways, it was, that's the environment where I met Brian Cotts, and you have to remember, this is before comics were cool, okay? Like, I was like I was a weird, I almost want to call it a super collector. The first thing I got obsessed with was stamps, and then I got obsessed with trading cards. And by obsessed, I mean it's not all I thought about, but it's most of what I thought about. And I was just obsessed with how beautiful they were. They're kind of fetishistic. Like I want to own these things. Okay, and then comics came after trading cards. And yeah, that lasted years. And again, like it was in high school, you didn't advertise that you read comics. It wasn't cool. Okay, this was before comics were cool. You kept it low key. Amazing how things have changed. I mean, the New York Times, Robert Crumb, the great underground comics cartoonist, he talks about how the New York Times made comics, like the way they try and make comics respectable is they call them graphic novels. This is how polite society refers to comics. And Crumb's like, that's all bullshit. They're comics, you know, like spare me your pretensions, New York Times. And everyone else who's trying to pass these off as graphic novels, that's acceptable. You know, in a sense, you could say the term graphic novels is a legacy of when comics were not respectable, which was kind of most of their history, frankly. And it's a very rich, very fascinating, beautiful history. A true American tradition. So Brian Cotts, he was a writer, and he ended up working at a book and record store, CDs too, it's the 90s, in Saskatoon called Tramps. And it had a few different locations. Like, so he was there for a few years, and so he moved with the locations. And because I lived about 5 minutes outside of Saskatoon, as I like to tell people, I lived just outside the middle of nowhere. That's where I grew up. My mom worked downtown, in downtown Saskatoon, and my grandma lived there. So what I would do from grade 4, I would get on the bus from elementary school. I'd go downtown, hang out for an hour and a half, 2 hours until my mom was done work, maybe an hour. And that's when I got to know Brian, and Brian was sort of like a teacher looking for a student to a certain degree. I mean, he similar to Mike, he had just a wealth of information, which you're going to hear of today. Just an absolute wealth of information. And where's the audience? And this is where where the guests of this podcast, like, yeah, maybe I'll have some more well-known people on. Maybe we'll get Vail from Research Publications. But I want to have people on like Brian who are an absolute wealth of information and who are not at all celebrated or frankly recognized for what they are. And so that's why I said in the last episode, my guests are going to be people you've never heard of for the most part. And yeah, I mean, Brian actually introduced me to Research Publications. If you never heard of that, one of the great sort of independent counterculture publishers of the 80s and 90s. He's still around, Vale, and I talk to him every once in a while on the phone. And he visited Berlin a couple of years ago. He had computer problems. I brought him my computer and saved the day. That was a funny little episode. And so Brian introduced me to a lot of the counterculture, whether it was William Burroughs, J.G. Ballard, which I later wrote my master's thesis on the atrocity exhibition, and also, Devo, Philip Glass, the whole gamut that now has sort of become, I don't want to say it's mainstream, but it's a lot more well-known after 2000. Like, in a sense, the Smiths, it's not special to know who the Smiths are anymore, but in the 80s and 90s, particularly in the 90s, I mean, I was pretty young in the 80s, but in the 90s, it said something. If you knew who New Order and the Smiths were, that said that you were cool, right? And then this got co-opted by the whole alternative, quote unquote. That was like a corporate meme, for lack of better terms, to describe this kind of counterculture that kind of had its kind of roots in what I'd say is William Burroughs and J.G. Ballard. I mean, if you read Ian Curtis's biography by Deborah Curtis, and what you'll see in there is that pretty much Ian Curtis's two biggest influences were William Burroughs and J.G. Ballard. And to the point where there's the atrocity exhibition, the song at the beginning of Closer. And there's Interzone, which I think was on Unknown Pleasures, which is based on a William Burroughs short story, the name of a short story. Yeah, so this counterculture, like, long story short on the counterculture, like, I see William Burroughs as kind of a founding father of what I consider the kind of last half of the 20th century counterculture, kind of what I'd call the modern counterculture, which in a weird way has sort of been co-opted at this point, or sort of become mainstreamed. If you look at the beatniks, William Burroughs was basically the old guy that inspired, say, Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. He was like the granddaddy of them all. I used to call him the guy who shot back, and he's got a mixed legacy too. I mean, he shot his wife, and I think people give him too much of a pass sometimes on his kind of moral failings, but a notorious writer and interesting writer. And what's funny about Burroughs, just a quick thing on Burroughs, is I think his value is in the audio recordings. Like, if you read Naked Lunch, which I did at 16, I found it actually, like, I could appreciate certain areas. I think the first page is actually the best part of the entire book. I can feel the heat closing in, feel them, et cetera, et cetera. The first 3 pages, I say go and read that. That's excellent. After that, to me, it's more conceptual appreciation of what Burroughs is doing. And for me, it's the audio recordings that are where he really shines. That voice and the humor comes out. And he was a great satirist. And I think that kind of gets lost in the books. His books are interesting. He's got great imagery. The cut-up method that in the Third Mind that he developed with Brian Geisen, which are very influential on, like, David Bowie. Even myself, I use the cut-up method once in a while. And what's funny about the cut-up method is it's a fairly simple proposition, but few people ever actually get to the point of printing out that piece of paper, starting to cut it, rearranging it, thinking about it. It's actually harder than it sounds. It's as simple to do in theory, but in practice, it's rarely performed, even though now there's quite an awareness of all the cut-up method and everything. So all to say, yeah, Brian introduced me to this counterculture. And again, so the beatniks ultimately led to the hippies. When you look at Bob Dylan, John Lennon, they put William Burroughs on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. He's one of the guys. Like, so it's very important, the whole drug culture, ayahuasca, the Yahe letters between Ginsberg and Burroughs. All of this together, his influence was enormous, and Brian really introduced me to what I would call is that tradition, okay? That counterculture tradition, which still kind of exists, although in certain respects it's kind of dying out. But I see myself, like that's how I position myself in that tradition. I see Vail definitely in that tradition. I mean, he did very influential books on Ballard and Burroughs and Devo, who's still around, you know. So Brian introduced me to all of these ideas, you know, even John Cage. I was very fortunate in that respect because Saskatoon is not, you know, it's not easy to come across those ideas in the 90s. Anyway, long story short, I ended up in university and I was taking these great Neoplatonism classes from Kevin Corrigan, great professor that ended up going to Emory, Ivy League school in the States. I think he's got a chair there. It's like basically gets paid to think and teaches if he wants to, from what I understand. And these Neoplatonism classes were so phenomenal that I kept telling Brian about them that he ended up taking them. And he ended up going back to school and we ended up doing our masters together at the University of Saskatchewan. I wrote on the Atrocity Exhibition by J.G. Ballard, which took some persuading, but I managed to convince Peter Stoichev, who is now president of the University of Saskatchewan, who I need to write to. It's been a while. And so we spent 3 years there, and then I eventually moved to Montreal, Toronto, and here I am in Berlin. Anyways, I've kept in contact with Brian, and I said, Brian, we need to do, as I sort of rethought this podcast a few weeks ago with Yuki, I want you to be on, Brian. You're like the perfect guy to have on this show, unrecognized and full of amazing ideas, and you're going to get exposed to a lot of interesting ideas. This is what it's like to talk to Brian, you know, and this is just a snapshot, you know, like there is so much more to discover. So I'm going to have Brian on regularly, okay, maybe once every 4 to 6 weeks. I'm thinking, but yeah, so that is what we have to look forward to, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. Quick update. I like to make this also about my journey as an artist. And so the update on that is I've been trying to make things physical. I've been working a lot digitally in the last couple of years, and I realized you do need to have a physical product at the end of the day. So I have been working on that. Unfortunately, so I was going to Bethanian, and I had a date there. You have to wait 6 weeks to use their digital printers. It's hard to get an appointment. But I had a day there, and unfortunately the guy was sick who runs the digital printing area. And so that was closed down for the day. I thought, okay, turn, you know, what I learned in first year philosophy, Ed Thompson, turn defeat into victory. If you go in London, there's a statue somewhere close to the Parliament, and I can't remember who it is. It's some general from World War II, I think. And it says defeat into victory. And if you ever see that, that's a very famous line, and it's about turning defeat into victory. So I show up at this thing, and very influential on me. This is very practical, because we all face defeats, right? And so I go to Bethanian, I find out I've waited a month for this appointment. I was going to print all day, had big plans, prepared 2 days, all my files. So I thought, how do I turn this defeat into a victory? And I thought, oh, you know what? I've been meaning to use the screen printing studios. I'm going to just go and talk. And the woman who was explaining to me that the digital printing area was closed for the day was there. And so I was like, oh, well, maybe I could ask you about that. I've been meaning to. So luckily, someone just canceled. They had an appointment a few days later. So I was going to go, and then I got a phone call saying they're actually having a special holiday for 2 days, and they're taking a couple of days off. She didn't know. So anyways, that got canceled too, but that's fine. And so you know what I did? Fuck this, I'm not going to, and I told her, that's life, all good. But I thought to myself, turn defeat into victory. How can I turn this into a victory? So I started sending out emails, and I found this place called Druck 3000, which means Print 3000 in Berlin, because I was looking up risographs, and I'd never done risographs before. And so I just sent them an email and just said, hey, I've been working on some stuff. I'm curious, how does this work? Can I just make an appointment? And so they said, here, why don't you send us a link of what you're working on, and we'll let you know and it's like, okay, that's fine. So I've been trying to figure out how to do this Peloponnesian War series, which you can find on the Instagram at Pocobelli. And I was like, oh, well, I'll send them some of that series from my website, some of the pieces, and just they can take a look. They're very enthusiastic. And so they asked for grayscale CMYK PDFs separated. So you have to figure out how to split that properly. It's a couple of YouTube tutorials. So, okay, did that and sent it and then got a test. And so now I have a physical product. And it's not perfect. There are certain areas that I'm concerned about, but now I can see what the technology does. And I thought to myself, I was actually telling Florian, shout out to Florian at 3000.de. So I went and picked him up in Berlin. It was in Mitte, Prenzlauerberg area. And he gave me a whole bunch of samples of what they can do, just like these, 40 different colors and different papers. And I thought to myself, and I told Florian, I should try and tailor some of these to your guys' process. Because then, I'm not going to be trying to get your process to work with my process and get a sort of in-between result. Let's see if I can sort of start making mixes that kind of fit your process really well and almost customize them to the medium. So that's where I am right now. So I'm going to send them a few more tests. Really interesting results so far. You can see them on the Instagram. Or if you go to Druck3000 on Instagram, you can also see they posted a picture and showed some enthusiasm. So that's always appreciated. So we are getting physical stuff done. It's just brutal persistence. That's what we're up to here. So without further ado, let me introduce Brian. Brian is now I don't know if you call him an associate lecturer, a sessional lecturer at the University of Saskatchewan. He teaches English literature, which is what we studied. And he's on summer break, and he tells us all about so many things. Coronavirus, biosemiotics, J.G. Ballard we talk about. We talk about modern publishing. What else do we talk about? We talk about pataphysics. We talk about Baudrillard. We talk about nature. And what else? We talk about Richard Powers, an author that he's reading right now. Talk about some of his Twitter and Microsoft Word or Pages drawings that he's doing, which is very interesting, using a word processor to make visual images. We talk about Alfred Jarry's influence on modernism, and I thought there was a lot of new, really, I think, provocative ideas there. And we also talk a lot about science and its relationship to art and its importance, and it's a way of making things relevant. So tons going on in this one. You can always go deeper with Brian. So I hope you enjoy this. So here is my interview with Brian Cotts. So here is Brian Cotts joining us live from Saskatoon. Brian, you're in Saskatoon right now.
Yeah, I'm still in Saskatoon.
Good. How are things? How's the university?
Well, I mean, right now everything is sort of shut down. All the classes are online. They're talking about opening up everything in the winter, but I kind of doubt they're going to do that. I think that it's kind of tense right now. Layoffs. I think that the university has maybe there's some budgetary problems too because of COVID. And it's an interesting experience. I've been teaching online now 2 classes or a class and a half because the last class, the last full class I taught was truncated because of COVID. So halfway through, I had to start putting together notes packages and transfer everything to online. Over the summer, I taught a poetry class, and it was totally online. I recorded lectures and barely had any interaction with students really beyond a forum. It was not exactly a nightmare, but not great.
Gotcha. Yeah. So how's the interaction? Would you consider it? Yeah, it's not as good as a classroom, I assume.
On one hand, it isn't. On the other hand, though, it is, because the one nice thing about the forum format, because I had a chat room or a chat forum for my students, they were more willing to chime in and communicate if they were behind their screen. So when they're typing at a distance, they're a lot more open than they are when they're just sitting in a classroom. I thought that was kind of interesting.
That is interesting. For the Northern Miner, the newspaper that I sometimes work for, I was part of a little digital conference that they were doing, and I found that I was surprised at how relaxed I felt doing this sort of interview in front of 200 people, because it was almost like I wasn't getting the physical presence of being on a stage. It was just it was all mediated by screens. So it was almost all the kind of nervous physiological factors just kind of weren't there in the same way. My adrenaline was up, but it wasn't like the, heart palpitations as you take the stage in front of 200 people or something.
Yeah, I totally get that. The problem I have with it is the actual lecture format. For me, if I want an interactive classroom where I have to build my lectures on their feedback, it's difficult to conduct a lecture when I'm recording a bunch of essentially prefab interpretations of literature mixed with some of my own insights, and then just putting it online and hoping somebody listens to this lecture, right? You don't get the feedback there. But as far as student interactivity was concerned, I was surprised. More people were willing to type on the forum, and more people were willing to share personal experiences on the forum because I think they felt safer behind the screen.
And it's almost like you're invisible if you don't say anything with the screen, right? Like, I guess, would you do Zoom where everybody's sort of tiled, like, and you can see everybody at once? Or was it just like whoever's talking appears on the screen? Like, could you see everybody?
It was like a bulletin board posting situation where I would create a topic on a forum and then people would just type responses and chat that way. The university's infrastructure isn't powerful enough to handle everybody Skyping or Zooming at the same time.
Right.
I mean, this is actually testing the stability of all of our internet, hopes and dreams, right? The great cyberpunk revolution where everybody's going to be wired, right? This is testing it, and it's not really passing the test. I mean, lots of people are used to looking at YouTube videos and playing video games, but when you have a class of 50 people and ostensibly you're supposed to have 50 little tiles and everybody's talking at the same time, the actual tech infrastructure crashes. There's just way too much data being transferred. Yeah, and it sounds like like you were saying earlier, the budgets are really being hammered at these universities. I mean, you hear about this once in a while, tuitions for international students, for example, which I think are a real cash cow, have probably halved, if not more. And then there's all the people who don't feel like, with tuition being so expensive, and then they're offered Zoom classes, they say, maybe I'll just skip a year and work, and then maybe everything will be fine in a year. Yeah, there is that. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in the fall. I've got a couple classes lined up. I don't know how well how satisfied the students are going to be. I mean, they know, I think, going into it at this point, that it's all going to be online. It's going to be asynchronous, which means that basically I throw everything into the void and they get around to looking at it whenever they get around to looking at it. And so you hope they'll look at it. But so it's not even live. It's not even live. Yeah. Wow. I come on at what I decided to do was show up sort of by logging in during the class period. And if anybody wants to email me or Skype me or anything, I'll be there to communicate with them one-on-one. But beyond that, everybody is just kind of left to their own devices. That's pretty amazing. It's like the great courses. I mean, you watch a lecture and I guess except you can email the professor or Skype with the professor. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Actually, interesting thing, over the summer class, the poetry class I taught, I had a German student. She was going to come into the U of S, but she got landlocked because of COVID. So basically, she took her entire class from Germany. I don't know. I think maybe she might have even been in Berlin. That's funny. So we were just kind of communicating back and forth, and she was writing her stuff, and I was marking it, and she was always just sort of in her little apartment in Germany. So that's cool too. I mean, here you had somebody who literally is on the other side of the world taking a class, and there's really no downside to that. I think you can extend your reach, right? You sure can. And it kind of, it really makes you start thinking. I mean, I imagine you already have started thinking about this. Like, if you can start giving great lectures online, I mean, that's a whole, like, it seems like that's where everything's going to end up going. If you project out 2 or 3 years, you're just going to have great professors
who, if you can give great classes, people will probably just sign up to these professors, I'm guessing. I don't know. Have you thought much about that?
Yeah, maybe, try to do something like that. I mean, if Slavoj Žižek can sputter and mutter and stumble his way through like 2-hour-long marathon lectures, I can do the same. That don't make much sense. I can do the same thing.
Yeah. And how was the poetry class? What were you teaching? Just an introduction, or was it something more specialized?
No, it was just an introduction. But I mean, I ended up, it's got to be a survey because of the way the university works with the intro classes. So you've got to hit a bunch of benchmarks. But at the same time, by the end of it, I was teaching avant-garde stuff. I had, Gertrude Stein and Alfred Jarry and things like that because I've got enough, right? So I actually had a few students who were really interested in Jarry. They'd never heard of Jarry before, right? And so I'm talking about Dr. Faustrol and pataphysics and Peru-Boo, and they were kind of drawn to that. It sort of opened their mind. And Gertrude Stein had a lot of resentment amongst more traditionally minded students, but there were some who just loved the kind of crazed word salad aspect of her writing. And you combine that with little packages on Cubist art and surrealism and pataphysics that they can download if they want to, right? I scoured the internet for cool images and shit like that and just sort of threw it out there, right? And some students, they fell in love with it. Others couldn't care less. But there were students that were turned on by that stuff.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, I think I'm sure you introduced me to Jarry way back when. And yeah, if your imagination is so inclined, it just lights up your imagination. I mean, the whole, especially Faustrol and that image of him sailing across the cement streets of Paris in a skiff.
Yeah, made out of water.
Made out of what?
Water.
Was it made out of water?
I think it had to be made out of water because he was traveling through cement. So I think his boat had to be made out of water.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Just captures in the ape. I can't remember his name. Who always replied, "Ha ha." Yeah, Jarry. Yeah. I mean, he really, that aesthetic still is still one of the most powerful that I can think of, actually. And what's funny is it's not like I read his writings all the time and love them. It's really about, for me, it's about his aesthetic, this kind of imaginative, just out of this world sort of imaginative thing, just of reversals and playfulness. But maybe it's just really philosophical at the same time, which I liked, but not in an overly serious way, like in just a very playful way.
Yeah.
So I don't know, do you have any deeper thoughts on Jarry, and why do you like Jarry?
One of the reasons I like Jarry is when I read Ubu Ra in high school, I thought it was cool and sort of neat, but other than just being sort of a big fuck you to everything, I thought, yeah, this guy's okay. But I kind of wanted more. Once I read stuff like Faustrol, though, and Jarry started... He really started clicking with me at that point. I mean, Jarry has his specially bred bacteria that keep him shaved and cleaned, right? And immediately I'm thinking there's nanotechnology.
There's science, that science theme.
And it's high, and it's for the 19th, early 20th century sort of aesthetic. It's really high functioning science. The idea of specially bred bacteria to keep you clean is funny, but I mean, it's also the roots of stuff like nanotechnology. And that's what really got me. The way Jarry would fuse this kind of extremely absurd science or proto-science or speculations on science with his crazy vision, and how, not to sound too pretentious, but I mean, how some of that stuff is starting to, in a weird way, come true, or people are starting to explore the ideas that Jarry put out about manipulating the physical world and changing the physical world in a kind of post-human or transhuman way without even really realizing it. Jarry doesn't realize that's what he's doing, and scientists these days that are exploring things like matter manipulation, etc., they don't realize that this is the genesis of some of this stuff is things that filtered through Alfred Jarry. And I thought that was really interesting, that here's this guy who's had this enormous effect, this invisible effect on the scientific world, and also to a certain extent, an enormous effect on art too. I mean, you have all of the experimental weird, the surrealism, the cubism, Dadaism, all this stuff comes out of Jarry. Modernism comes out of Jarry after a fashion. I think James Joyce, his writing starts getting weirder and weirder after he meets Gertrude Stein, or at least reads some of Gertrude Stein's writing. Gertrude Stein probably didn't meet Jarry, but she's sort of an after effect of the stuff that Jarry set into motion. Right. And even people who like the hardcore realists and the postmodernists and the anti-postmodernists or traditionalists of today, they themselves are either intentionally or unintentionally embracing aspects of Jarry's vision or rebelling against it directly. The hardcore, hard-nosed realist writers and artists are rebelling against the craziness that Jarry set in motion. And so he's enormously influential, and people don't recognize this because he is a largely obscure figure. He didn't live very long, and he had a brief but powerful impact with the right people at the right time. And then that his tendrils just kind of expanded throughout the world.
Yeah, he is a bit of an artist in a sense, right? And it's interesting how you say how important he was to modernism, because I don't disagree with it, because I think like a lot of his writing was in the 1890s, right? Isn't that right?
90s, very early, so 1900s.
Yeah, like I think maybe Fostrel it's 1899, 1904, like it's early, right?
Yeah.
And so Cubism isn't that long after, and that Jarry was probably already being passed around in the sort of avant-garde circles. French literature in general was sort of held in pretty high esteem, like Lautréamont, who wrote Maldoror, the Black Bible of Surrealism, which Magritte loved and everybody else. Huge impact. Anyway, that's pretty interesting. So there is still an appetite for Jarry, and I'm not surprised. I think probably a lot of those students in Saskatoon and Germany are probably pretty grateful to actually learn that stuff. And what as far as the university, anything else? Is Peter Stoichev, our former English professor, he's the president, I think, at the University of Saskatchewan. Has he been making speeches or anything, or have you heard from him?
I haven't really heard directly from him. I've been focused more on just getting everything in order so I can teach my couple classes in the fall right now. I want to set everything up so it runs smoothly. So to a certain extent, I've been steering clear of a lot of university politics, probably for the best, because that sort of thing tends to drive me a bit insane. So
yeah, I mean, it's funny. University politics, though, it's almost like it has a tabloid-like quality that it's something I just never get tired of hearing about. At the same time, like you said, there were layoffs. Like,
doesn't affect you directly though as it affects me. So
it does affect you, or it doesn't?
It doesn't affect you as directly as it affects me. But I don't know.
But there are layoffs.
There have been layoffs, yeah, and there have been a bunch of packages that the university's putting together to try to coax tenured or sort of high level individuals to retire. Because I think I think the budgets are getting stretched a little bit.
Totally, with all the huge amount of administrators and all that stuff. I would think you're right.
One nice thing about this is, the COVID scare is at least kickstarting types of scientific endeavor again in sort of large scale ways. Even if it's only attempts to make vaccines, people are starting to pay attention to what scientists are doing in the world a little bit more. And science is becoming a bit more important to people again. It's not quite as abstract and lofty.
Right.
People want their vaccine. I mean, other than, the anti-vaxxers who don't believe that viruses exist or whatever. But people who aren't insane want their vaccines, and they're starting to pay attention to what science is doing and what technology is capable of. And I think that's a good if there's a good thing that came out of COVID, I think that's one of them.
I totally agree with that. And in fact, I think it's actually, in a weird way, it's given more credibility to science because it had been so under attack for the global warming thing for the last 20 years that it was almost just becoming like a rhetorical, it was becoming for politicians, it was okay to dismiss scientists as, and science. And what I think the COVID thing has done is with all these guys who are saying, oh, you don't need to mask up, like science and nature are basically humiliating these guys who are heavy on rhetoric and low on facts, and low on science. And these science skeptics are getting brutally punished. It's a brutal lesson, it seems to me.
If they acknowledge that it's a lesson, but eventually they'll all get sick and they'll have to be forced to acknowledge it. But
it's interesting, right? Because there's this whole tradition of even just anti-evolution type stuff that still exists. There's a bit of a weakness there, or like in sense for me, like politically, science has become my new main issue. Mm-hmm. It's like that's what I vote on. If a politician is anti-science, I don't care what party they're from. Like it's secondary to me compared to the economy. That's what this whole pandemic has shown for me. It's like that. If you're great on the economy, but you don't believe in science, well, that's not too good. I don't support that. Like to me, that's less important, the economy, than science.
Well, what's good the economy if we're all dying of a plague?
Yeah, or if we can't even do simple things that science is telling us because we have our heads up our ass, so far that we just can't even, like if we don't trust science and we're not going to make decisions based on science, where does that leave us? Yeah, we can have, even our economy. At what point does the economy will start to suffer as it has? Look at the U.S., which is a catastrophe right now. So what else is new? How's life in the city? Everything good? Are you going out much, or are you staying in most of the time?
I tend to stay in a lot of the time. I do get a little bit squirrely, so sometimes I have to go to the occasional bookstore or get groceries, but I tend to stay in. We don't have a lot of COVID in the city right now, and I like that. But the more people get together, the worse things are going to get right now. Just recently there have been some spikes because of Hutterite colonies in Saskatchewan who weren't following the COVID guidelines. And now there's been a huge upswing, mostly out on the prairies. There's the occasional case in Saskatoon. But I don't want to be around people who are going to get me sick, right? I'm starting to move into that demographic where this will actually deeply affect me. Although then again, there are a lot of young people who are getting this crap too now. So
yeah, it's interesting out here, like in, I guess, late March and most of April, everybody, like the streets got really quiet. There was basically the full lockdown. And now the last 2 times I went out, people are trying to shake my hand. Mm-hmm. People want to hug. They're trying to share drinks, and it's just like, you just get the sense this thing's coming back.
Yeah. No, nobody wants to hug me, so that's good. It's the one of the few times I've been grateful that nobody wants to hug me.
Yeah. And so, I don't even want to go out because all of a sudden people they're even insulted if you don't want to shake their hands, and they're making fun of the little elbow thing. And it's like, okay, it's like they're embarrassed to be cautious.
Yeah.
That's what I sort of see out here. And it's like, that's a bit of a weird thing. As if. But I guess maybe it's just, it feels unnatural for people to just,
when everything first shut down in Saskatoon, it was kind of creepy. I went out a few times because occasionally you do have to go to the grocery store or get a bit of hardware or something for your computer. And, you're driving around and there are no cars, or maybe there's 3 cars. You've been driving for an hour and you've seen 3 or 4 cars. You go downtown and the only people that are around are the homeless people, and
it's that really quiet.
It's not that quiet right now, but when it first locked down, it was kind of like an post-apocalyptic movie.
Yeah, same with Berlin. It was just like, you'd see these famous landmarks, and even still, like Italy, like I hear it's just totally dead and quiet. And I mean, these countries like Greece and Italy, I think they're getting a few tourists, but even I think Spain just locked down again. So it's a real wrench in the global economy. As I describe it, as like sand being poured into the engine of global capitalism. And it's another interesting thing is just how long it's going on for. Yeah. Like, it's like we keep expecting that one day we'll wake up and it's all, starting to disappear. It's almost like that's what I see in the behavior, is that it's starting to disappear. It's like people are bored with the story.
Yeah.
And but it's not. It's interesting.
Well, it's reality, right? And this is one of the first times in ages where people have been forced to acknowledge that there's a real physical world beyond their own perceptions. As much as I like stuff like Baudrillard, and as much as I like a lot of postmodern rambling about the textualization of fill in the blank, there's still a hard physical world behind all of that. Baudrillard can talk about the death of the real all he wants, but it's still, until we get to the point where you have nanotechnology that can physically change things on the quantum level, there's still going to be a hard physical reality behind everything that underpins it all. And I think a lot of times we've lost sight of that, either on both the left and the right. For the right, everything seems like, well, it'll just be a sort of a status quo, or if they're deeply religious, well, God will take care of everything and everybody. On the left, everything is social, everything is textual, everything is subjective, everything is fluid, forgetting that underneath it all, there's still that hard, physical, real world that everybody has to interact with, that doesn't actually care about any of our ideology or any of our politics or our religious beliefs or anything. It's just a real, natural world. And it does what it does for its own reasons, if it even has reasons. And they may not actually dovetail with ours, And people are starting to, at least some people are starting to really have to face that. And that's creating a kind of rebellion, because people don't want to stop to think that, maybe we're not the pinnacle of everything. Maybe society and social philosophy isn't the pinnacle of everything. Maybe we're not at the top level of all of creation and God created the universe for us. No, there's this other world that if it decides it's time for us to die, it's just going to kill us all. And there's not a damn thing we can do about it, because it supersedes us. So I think people are being made very uncomfortable by this. And like you said, everybody's waking up thinking, well, it's a dream. It'll be over. No, it's not going to be over until it's over. And it is the thing that calls the shots, not us. If it takes a year to make a vaccine, if it takes 2 years to make a vaccine, if we can never make a vaccine, that's dependent on the nature of the virus. That's not dependent on anything that relates to us as subjective, social, philosophical, textual, manipulative beings.
I absolutely agree with you. I actually want to write an essay about this very thing. I was going to call it The Revenge of the Real. And to your point, it's like the hyper real world of simulation, and that everything is basically rhetoric and persuasion, and that the mass media has triumphed somehow over reality. That's all been sort of undermined by this. So, the revenge of the real, that there is still a real, and it actually calls the shots, as you say. And there's something kind of like, it's a huge tragedy. There, as we all know, and there are, but there is a kind of a truthfulness that comes with the virus, that it's kind of reminded us about reality. And in that respect, there is a kind of, there is a silver lining to this thing, I guess is my point.
Have you ever read Darkness by Byron, the poem?
No, is that a poem?
Yeah, you should check it out. I teach it. It tends to go over fairly well with science-minded students, or in some cases, environmentally minded students. sometimes environmental activists or students who are kind of environmentally activists, they don't like it, in part because basically it's a poem where the sun goes out. And it was inspired by a volcano that blew in the 1900s that blanketed Europe with ash and basically created a year without a summer, where the clouds, the skies were just dark, lamps had to be lit, crops were failing. At the same time, there were sunspots. There was huge sunspot activity that could be seen by the naked eye. So individuals in London and all around Europe who were covered with this, sort of faced with this sort of volcanic winter that never ended, they everything is dark, everything's grim and cloudy, all the crops are dying because there's not enough light for proper photosynthesis. The weather is in turmoil, and then they can look at the sun and they can see these blobs on the sun, like the sun is starting to get consumed with cancer. And it caused a kind of mass panic. And on top of it all, Byron's relationship with his wife dissolved in the same year or around that time too. And this all inspired Byron to write this poem about the sun going out. And in the poem, it's a short enough read, but it's kind of a symbolic narrative poem. Basically, the sun goes out for no apparent reason. And then the earth is just plunged into darkness and turmoil. Humanity, desperate for heat and sunlight, just starts to just burn everything that it can for light, hoping that the sun will come back. People are praying for the sun to come back. The sun doesn't come back. They fall into despair. Other people are kind of gleefully nihilistic that the sun has gone out and everybody's going to die. And they're sort of the happiest of the bunch because they get to sort of go out cackling in the ruins. Other people who are just sort of hoping for the sun to come back and who are saving stuff and saving their resources realize the sun's never going to come back, and all of their hoarding has been for nothing because they're just extending the misery. And the poem basically details the planet Earth slowly freezing because the sun goes out. Nature itself is turned into turmoil. All the animals are dying. Everything just dies. And the end of the poem just simply has, dark. The universe is darkness. The sun has gone out. The earth still exists as a frozen blob, and every organism on the earth is dead. And there's no reason for it. There's kind of maybe a biblical parody going on where, implying, that the beginning of Genesis, God says, let there be light. Well, maybe one day God will say, let there be darkness. Either God creates light for whatever God's reason is. Maybe God will create darkness for whatever God's reason is. We don't know. And the general gist of the whole poem is that nature or the universe has its own rules, and that everything that we believe about nature, everything that we think about nature, in the poem there's parts Byron addresses the idea that, our philosophies, all of our needs, all of our cares, all of this stuff is dependent upon a nature that allows us to exist. And if nature just suddenly changes so we're no longer able to exist, everything that we believe about the universe is not going to help us. We will just simply cease to exist. And all of our philosophies, our politics, our belief systems, everything is the result of a sense of security and a sense of feeling safe in the world, that we know there will be another day tomorrow. It's a very interesting poem. You should check it out, man.
I definitely want to check that out. And it almost sounds like an early kind of proto science fiction-y type thing, just in terms of its content. Do you think that's a fair assessment? I mean, look at Mary Shelley, same thing. I mean, it's pretty science fiction-y, some of the romantic stuff.
Yeah, it's sort of a proto-apocalyptic kind of sci-fi narrative. The interesting thing about it, though, is that in the end, humanity doesn't flourish, right? In most end of the world scenarios, there's always the scrappy band of survivors that starts society over again. No, Byron says that's not going to happen. That's bullshit. If nature decides we're dead, we're dead. There's nothing that we can do to stop it.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome that you can actually do that in a poem. It makes me reinterested in poetry again. Not that I like the epic poetry and all that, but yeah, poetry, it's not like I sit down and read poetry very often, but that's the great thing about teaching it is you're kind of forced to, and all of a sudden you find all these gems. I was going to say with Alfred Jarry as well, there's also that sort of scientific themed literature. And I mean, that's maybe the real better way of putting it, because science fiction is maybe saying too much. It's science-based.
Yeah, it's science-based. It's scientific. Without really being what we know as sci-fi, it's inspired by science. But briefly back to Byron, though, just to my initial point before I started to rant, the students who read this poem, I mean, there are students who just look at it and go, whatever, it's a poem, I got to read it because the guy there's teaching it. So there's that cohort, we can kind of ignore them. But then there's the ones who are deeply offended by it because it argues that there's simply nothing we can do to save the environment if the environment decides it's time for us to go. They still believe, for all of their kind of equality of nature, that human beings are a part of nature, nature is a part of humanity, we're all kind of interrelated. They still believe that we're at the top of the ladder, and that what we do has a deep, deep, meaningful effect on nature. And so the idea that if the sun goes out, there's nothing we can do about it, and it's nothing we personally caused either, it's just the sun winked out one day in Byron's poem, that upsets them, because it upsets the idea that for all of their sort of enviro-egalitarianism, Byron's still saying, you're not at the top. There's really nothing you can do. Planet Earth is still okay at the end of darkness. It's just in a different form that doesn't support humanity. The planet Earth is now a frozen ball, but the planet Earth doesn't care if it's a frozen ball or if it's a lush Edenic forest. The planet Earth is the planet Earth. It doesn't care what form it's in. Human beings care what form the planet Earth is in, but that's still something that comes out of a sense of,
it's like a morality play. It's like it's like actually you can't fix it, and that's the thing that sets them off. Maybe it's like this. It's like, no, there's got to be a moral. It's got to be a kind of heroic narrative where at the end we save the day. And we can do that. And you're saying there is no heroic narrative possible. When you look at Byron's poem, and therefore the implication is, maybe the so-called global warming or climate change is not fixable.
Yeah, it may be fixable. Like that's the point. It may not be fixable. We can't tell. And even if we can fix it, there's still entropy. The fact,
like eventually the sun is going out at a certain point.
Eventually the sun will explode and we'll all be gobbled up, and we may all be dead long before that happens. But and even if the sun wasn't going to burn out, swell and then contract and then explode, even if that didn't happen, if the sun will eventually kind of run out of energy. The planet Earth, if the universe is a closed system, the planet Earth will eventually run out of usable energy, because the law of entropy states that all usable energy turns into a form that's no longer usable by us. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that this unusable energy may not be usable by some other natural phenomenon, but it's still nothing that we can use, and there's really nothing we can do to prevent this. We can slow entropy down by borrowing energy from another system, which may speed up entropy in that system, and that eventually, temporarily, it slows our entropy, but ultimately entropy always accelerates. It's kind of like borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, right? Entropy is a constant downward slide. And now this is a downward slide that takes billions of years. So obviously, I mean, we've got a long way to go before the planet Earth becomes unsustainable. But the idea that we can have a direct impact forever on the planet, I think threatens the belief system of some individuals who do believe that everything is kind of, even if they acknowledge that, oh, well, in large time scales, there will be a point where human beings do just sort of evolve out of this form, or maybe we will go extinct. 100 million years from now, but we can make our lives good at this point. There's still that little bit of the back of their mind, I think, that might argue that no, but still there's this sense of eternity. We as human beings have a sense of eternity, that we can create something that's eternal, that we are eternal, and that the universe still revolves around us. So this poem threatens students who have that kind of belief system. And on the other hand, I do have students who look at the poem go, shit, I never thought of it that way. That for everything that we do to the universe doesn't actually care what we do to it. We do things to the universe that affect us directly, but the planet Earth doesn't care what form it's in. You know, even if we blew it into little chunks, eventually those chunks would maybe go out and, you know, join the Kuiper belt or something, and those bits, or maybe they'd crash to Mars or do something to Mars, or they'd fall into the sun over time. Either way, the chunks aren't going to care. You know, they're going to be in a different form of physical existence, but it's not going to matter to them. It matters to us, though, and that's the interesting thing. And maybe sometimes it's useful to step back and look at the really big picture, where we're divorced from everything, and just sort of take a look at the universe as impassionately and as objectively as possible. You can never really be totally objective, obviously, because you have to imagine the universe without you, which still means you're doing it for you. But it's a useful exercise, I think, to step back and think maybe the universe isn't this human-centric thing.
Well, it's kind of the history of intellectual ideas to a certain degree, at least with, you know, Galileo and Copernicus, and, you know, as a, you know, away from this heliocentric model of the universe, it is kind of like this more and more displacing humanity from the center. But there is that intuition and that urge, whether it's the Greeks or the Christians, for example, that want to put humanity at the center. Like, that's the intuitive viewpoint. That's the default, we might say. And even now we go, oh, well, consciousness makes us special. And even now people are trying to, you know, say, well, maybe we're not so special in that regard. And, you know, it's one more displacement from the center, you know.
Like panpsychism or animal consciousness?
Or just consciousness in general. People will say, well, we're special as humans because we have a rational faculty, we have language, we have consciousness we might say we have self-consciousness, let's put it that way. And we are supposedly more aware of ourselves, and probably, than animals. And I don't know. I wasn't talking that deeply, but just this idea that we're even more, we're a little less special even maybe in that regard, at least according to maybe some of the neuroscientists. And I don't know if they're really, I actually wrote an essay kind of not saying that their view is wrong. I mean, I basically it's a pretty persuasive view. I mean, I think the general view, I think, from most neuroscientists is this, I call it an emergent view, which is that ultimately, once the nervous system achieves a certain degree of complexity, particularly, I would think through the perceptual apparatus, that consciousness emerges as an emergent property.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't think that's a crazy idea.
No.
My sort of issue with that, I don't know if I'd call it like an Occam's razor argument. I don't know if that's appropriate, but it's not. I think my sort of simpler way, but albeit more crazy way, is you start with story. Like, if there's anything from the perspective of consciousness, I see what consciousness is to me is a story making machine. It's how am I aware of anything? It's through story that we tell ourselves from raw sense perception. We turn that into something. And that is, to me, what consciousness is. So my kind of crazy little essay that I put online is basically on, we need to start with story and then work from there, which is a very, I don't know where that gets us, but I think it's to me, it's a simpler approach, and therefore it's maybe a little bit sturdier. in that respect.
I know what you mean. I can't remember. There's somebody else who was arguing that at one point. So I think they framed it in use of metaphor or something. I can't remember who it was who I was reading who argued something along those lines.
If you do remember, send me the thing. I'd be curious to see. Yeah, because there are also, like, I sort of wrote that thing without doing too much research on what other people had to say on that, just because I sort of had a fully formed sort of thought that I just wanted to put into an essay. But yeah, I mean, there are, books on narrative is everything and, this sort of thing. So which isn't that far from sort of where I was coming from. I was sort of applying it to consciousness specifically in a sense, but yeah. So it's an interesting talk. Speaking of writing, are you writing much these days? I mean, I've always known you as a writer.
Off and on, I've started playing with kind of a novel thing that's autobiographical, and I was basically writing notes to try to edit these things together into a story, and then I realized maybe the notes are actually good enough on their own. So it's sort of a collection of weird fragments. I'm finding it difficult to really sit down and think of anything in a kind of long form, 20 chapter, 40 paragraph kind of mode right now. Everything is, 20 page chapter, 40 paragraph kind of mode. Everything is all sort of chopped up and fragmentary.
I like short these days. Like, I think short, it's sort of like the Atrocity exhibition with, not to always default to Ballard, but with his condensed novels. To me, that's a very modern thing because you don't need to spend all day reading it. Like it's kind of like people, people have been talking about this for a while now. People don't really read books anymore. Like, who's going to, let's say you write your 40 chapter, 2,000 page or 1,200 page book. Who's reading it? It's like, and if they're going to read a 1,200 page book or a 700 page book, they'll probably read Moby Dick, I don't know. Do you think, because you read a lot of books,
Stephen King or James Patterson at this point?
Do you know what I mean? Like, I would think it would be really hard for a non-famous name to write a 1,200 page book and have it be read.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Maybe if you make it brilliant enough.
No, I don't think
get it to write book publishers.
I don't think the publishing industry cares about brilliance. I don't think the publishing industry cares about anything beyond something that can move units now.
I think you're right.
The only things that can move units, generally speaking, are either the established writers or somebody who has kind of a way in because they know the established writers, or they have a publisher friend or an editor friend or something. That's about it. I mean, I know there are people who bitch and complain about all of the, if you go to a bookstore in Saskatoon, if you go to a book, James Patterson has an entire goddamn shelf. There's
who's James Patterson again? Is he like a thriller writer?
He writes thrillers, and he writes his thrillers under his own name, and he writes outlines that he farms out to a ghostwriter. So he's his own novels, and then he's got his novels with collaborators, and this allows him to have dozens and dozens of books. And
does he go under pseudonyms, or is it always James Patterson?
No, it's James Patterson, or it's James Patterson and, Jenny Craig or whatever.
It's almost like it reminds me of Jeff Koons. He makes his little image in Photoshop and then he gives it to all his assistants to paint a hyper-realistic oil painting, large scale.
Yeah, that's exactly
what I mean.
That's what it's like. And if you're a good enough James Patterson collaborator, in that if your 500-page crappy thriller, if it sells enough units, maybe you might be able to put your own name on a book that'll get published, and market through the Patterson machine. But I mean, he's a big writer. Stephen King is still a huge writer. I mean, and I don't hate Stephen King, but I mean, damn it, he's written enough books already. They're all the same book over and over again now.
And I've never actually read Stephen King other than How to Write. I think I read half that.
He's good up to a point. He's got a good sense of a kind of middle American working class tone. And he writes sort of really nice, practical, again, sort of middle American working class characters. But he's got the same half dozen types that he keeps on going back to. There's the sensitive, rough-hewn kind of country guy. There's the school jock. There's the abused or somehow traumatized girlfriend or wife. There's the little kid who's innocent, who loses his innocence, and the other little kid who's picked on. There's the shopkeeper who's the friendly shopkeeper who's always reliable. It's the same kinds of things. And then there's the evil guy who's just malevolently evil because he's been inhabited by beings from another dimension, and then there's a half dozen or dozen more of that trope. And he just kind of recycles things over and over again. And it's good for up to a point. He can hit interesting emotional beats because he does have an authenticity to his writing. But I mean, enough is enough already.
You don't get the sense that you're going to get like some huge revolution coming out of the Stephen King, and he's written, like you say, a ton of huge books.
Yeah. But at the same time, he's a proven commodity. So therefore, there's always going to be another one, even when he manages to piss off his base, or at least a large chunk of his base, because he's always sold to sort of right-leaning Americans, right? So
that's funny because he's one of the most outspoken anti-Trump people, isn't he?
Yeah, right? He really is. So I mean, he has been, even though he's managed to piss on all those people, he still sells. He doesn't
an American icon. Yeah, I guess he's allowed to do it, maybe. But the Dixie Chicks weren't. That's for sure.
I don't begrudge King exactly, but it's like enough is enough. And I mean, he's been around long enough that now a lot of people who are writing a contemporary literature consider him an influence. And so, I mean, I guess good for him. He's happy that now maybe the literary establishment is taking notice of him finally. But it's like, you've told your stories, I don't hate your writing. I have a fond memory of reading a number of his books when I was younger. But it's like, hang it up already. You don't have anything else to say.
So speaking of contemporary writers, are you excited by anything right now? Like you're really into, was it Gene Wolfe for a while?
Gene Wolfe for a while. I'm kind of out of Wolfe.
Are you excited by anything, or do you go back, or what do you do?
Right now, what have I been trying to read? I'm trying to get into Richard Powers. He's a little more obscure, although his most recent book hit it really big because I think it just sort of came out at a politically advantageous time. He's a writer who writes novels about science. He wanted to be a computer programmer. And I think he even became a computer programmer. I'm not sure. And then he started writing novels. And so each of his novels deals in some way with scientific phenomena. The Goldbug variation is all about DNA and sort of the sequencing of the genome. He's got a novel called, I think, Galatia 2.0, which is about artificial intelligence. He has novels about scientists and doctors exploring neurochemistry. And his most recent book is called The Overstory, and it's all about trees. And it's kind of from the perspective of the trees. It sets up a bunch of characters and then puts them into motion as they start to interact with things that are environmentally inflected or environmentally inspired. But the general tone of it is sort of a cool, detached, almost sort of, it's a tree-like viewpoint where we have characters, but they're all kind of flat. And they have their politics and they've got their interests, but there's a hint throughout the novel that, this is just kind of a little blip in the system, because the novel itself is more concerned with the perspective of these entities that have been around for millions of years and millions of years, and human beings are just we're just sort of in a little anomaly. So I'm trying to get into him, but I can't.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's like a novel that's trying to be from the point of view of trees. I got interested in him because I started looking up biosemiotics a couple years ago.
Okay, fill us in. What is biosemiotics?
Biosemiotics, as I understand it, is essentially there's a few branches of it, but ultimately it's a way of looking at the sign systems or the communication systems of all entities, like all entities or non-human entities. There are scientists that explore biosemiotics in a deeply scientific way, where they just talk about information transfer between proteins. And then biosemioticians from the humanities sort of sneak into the sciences and start trying to monkey with everything, pissing off the scientific biosemioticians. Because
I'm sure.
Somebody wants somebody who wants to talk about the information transfer between proteins doesn't suddenly want to have to read a whole bunch of fucking Deleuze, right?
Exactly. It's like, keep your critical theory out of our biosemiotics, thanks. But if you're going to call it biosemiotics, you're kind of open for attack, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
For critique.
It's hilarious. And I think it's really interesting because on one hand, I don't really care too much about what, Theodore Adorno might have to say about the mating rituals of the caterpillar. But on the other hand, it's sort of an interesting way of trying to bridge the humanities and the hard sciences in a way, because to a certain extent, both the humanities and a certain subset of science do deal with communication.
I was going to say, like, language is I don't think it's just a human thing.
No.
Like, I think anybody, if you really think about it, like, everything is in communication. Even trees are in communication. Like, there is this kind of, I don't know if I'd call it a feedback loop, but there is a dialogue between everything in nature, and everything is kind of talking to each other. And birds, it's not that humans are the only ones that have a tongue.
Yeah.
Like, birds chirp, and all animals can communicate, it seems. Like, I don't know about insects, but even them, they're making noises.
They communicate. Look at bees and look at ants. They problem solve, and they communicate on some level.
Yeah, so it actually sounds like a potentially rich field. I mean,
yeah.
It's interesting how science has come up over and over again throughout this discussion as this kind of, grounding of knowledge and of interesting things, a grounding of interesting things almost. And that's what I like about this biosemiotics thing. Again, and it's almost like that revenge of the like it's a little bit more real when you're dealing with science.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I like about science. It's a little bit, you're actually dealing with something that's not just a whole bunch of ideas that someone put together that make some philosophy that really don't have anything to do with reality. They're interesting as human nature, a specimen of what the human imagination has created. And that in itself is maybe a reflection of nature once removed. But ultimately, that's why I like science, because you're dealing with real things. Just like you talk about a novel about DNA, that's interesting. And so this biosemiotics thing, that sounds like a nice way of, I can see why some of the English or the critical theory people are sort of might be eager to jump on something like that. Because again, like you say, maybe it's a way out for the humanities in a way that they can sort of ground a lot of what they're talking about in science and give some discipline to critical theory. Because the problem is people just start talking about whatever.
Yeah.
And they go all over the place, and you're just like, it feels like it's not worth your time a lot of the time, because it's like, well, you think that, and what is that based on?
Yeah, exactly.
And anybody can say anything. It's like politics, So anyway, sorry, continue. Was there anything else on biosemiotics? So
the idea of just everything has a kind of communication ability to communicate. Everything trades or generates signs amongst entities, and I just think that's really interesting. And you were mentioning birds a little while ago, and did you know crows? This is something I read a while ago. Crows, they use tools, right? They use twigs to dig and stuff like that. And different crows in different parts of the countries in which crows can be found, they use twigs in specific ways that are unique to their communities. And if you introduce crows to different crow communities, say if I took some crows from Saskatchewan and moved them down to Florida, the crows from Saskatchewan would teach the Floridian crows how to dig with twigs The
That's
Saskatchewan
crazy.
and the Floridian crows would teach the Saskatchewan crows how to dig their way. That crows seem to have a kind of, again, sort of, it's not as maybe expansive as human culture, but they seem to have a kind of culture that somehow different groups of crows figure out how to use twigs in specific ways. And I was reading something about, what was it, fruit bats early. I think actually it was earlier today, or was it last night? Yeah, it was late last night. Apparently, fruit bats have a series of squeaks, have like several different types of squeaks for different kinds of phenomena, where they will squeak in certain ways to debate where they should hang in a cave. And they'll have little arguments and sort of argue about where they should be in the cave. They will squeak in different ways to different members of their families and their communities and stuff like that. It's something that scientists discovered by using some sort of algorithm to sort of decode all the squeaks. 'Cause I mean, squeaks sound like squeaks to us, right? But a computer can differentiate. And there are different kinds of, I guess, phrases, I guess you could call them, for different kinds of things that are important to fruit bats. And the tones of these phrases will change depending on the familiarity of the bats with one another. That fruit bats that are close together will squeak, that are friendly with one another will squeak at each other in a certain way. Others that are kind of socially distant with one another will squeak at each other in a certain way. That there are all these weird nuances to bat squeaks that suggest that, again, they have a kind of language.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in a weird way, it's unsurprising once you think of it. But traditionally, we do just think of humans as having language, but no. It's very interesting. And so you were telling me you got rid of all your Twitter. I was really enjoying when I would check in your Microsoft Word drawings, it's almost their paintings. You're the only person I know that made Microsoft Word paintings. Did you actually delete everything, or is there a record somewhere?
Oh no, I've got them all on.
Good.
I just got sick of Twitter because Twitter's just such a crazy cesspool of rage these days and paranoia. I just got kind of fed up with it. I mean, nobody's noticing my stuff anyway, so I guess I don't really have to worry about being attacked by Twitter trolls. But I don't know. I just stopped liking the environment on Twitter. I mean, we've got all these alt-right weirdos who are just going on and on about all of their alt-right shit. And now we've got all these lefty activist types who are just screaming and raging at every little infraction, The alt-right and the left are kind of attacking each other. But I started detecting that both of those groups are starting to attack centrists now. That being somebody
that's an
kind
interesting
of reasonable, and wants to entertain different perspectives is actually a greater sin than being a kind of dogmatic fundamentalist. Pick a side. Don't be a centrist. You're with us or against us. And I was just getting really, really sick of that. Nobody was noticing my Twitter shit. So, I want to try to put it on some other.
We should put it on TikTok.
Chinese. That'd be great.
Yeah, exactly. That's like the big problem. I deleted TikTok off my phone. I had it there. I barely used it. I've always found it was kind of, I guess, sophomore-ish, like it's something like if you're 15 and you're kind of nerdy, you'd be all over. But yeah, they really have struck a nerve. But one of the main reasons I think they're so successful is because people get the sense that if they put their video up there, it's going to be seen. Mm-hmm. And I think this is what Facebook and Instagram and even Twitter are kind of screwing up. We got to give preference to people, even LinkedIn, it's a CEO of General Electric. So he's got to have more of a say. So we're going to push him in our algorithm because we really want his content. And everybody else, you're just squeezed out. And I think that's why TikTok is doing so well. It's people feel, here is a platform that my work can actually get out there and be seen by millions of people potentially, and it's actually possible.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Unfortunately, it's TikTok.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, and exactly, run by about the last people in the world you want to be sending your data to.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe I'll come back on. Also, I was just getting really paranoid. I mean, one of the effects I've noticed of this whole lockdown is, I mean, I'm not a hugely social human being to begin with, but I still like to go places and I still like to interact with other members of my species, right? And just being in this house constantly, I start getting claustrophobic. Like, I mean, I would get claustrophobic when I was in my apartment, but I'd be able to leave occasionally.
Yeah. Are you, what is the state of the lockdown there? It's done, isn't it? Or
It's
not?
done, but like I said, I just don't really want to go out much. And so I tend to kind of really twitchy and paranoid. And I don't know, at one point, I was just like, I've got to get rid of all my Twitter stuff. I hate the world. I hate Twitter. I hate it all. I'm just destroying it all. And so I just deleted everything.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm not going to get rid of that stuff. I like that stuff. I've been working.
I think it's super original. Like, I don't know anybody drawing with Microsoft Word. That sounds like pretty avant-garde sort of thing you find in a gallery or something. Like, oh, I never thought of that.
And the weird fractured language and everything. I mean, I like that stuff.
I thought it sort of captured your sort of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, aesthetic. It sort of captured you.
So maybe I'll put it back up pretty soon. But I felt so satisfied when I got rid of it. I was like, there, fuck you, Twitter, I'm gone.
What's the Twitter handle for the handful of listeners that listen to this? Is it B. Cotts?
Brian
Or
Cotts.
Cottsweb, right?
No, it's just Brian Cotts.
Brian Cotts.
Just my name.
At Brian Cotts.
At Brian Cotts. Yeah, I mean, there's not going to be anything there for a while anyway, but
just to know. And yeah, so that's the state of that. Are you still making new ones?
Yeah, I'm still making new ones.
Good.
I got a bunch of stuff. I mean, again, I get kind of worked up and hit a bit of a block every now and then, primarily because of the environment. But I've got a few that are about the whole COVID lockdown and just sort of the rioting in the States and, well, I guess around the world and stuff. So,
do you ever try printing them out or making physical versions of these?
I don't really have anything that can do that right now. My printers are just a piece of crap. But I do want to really make physical copies.
I think that, it's something worth trying for, attempting. Like, I'm starting to go toward, like, as a digital, make a lot of my stuff digitally. And once I've started to figure out how to present it physically, it's a fun challenge. And it's actually quite difficult to do it in a kind of a smart way, you might say. But if you can do it in a way that's kind of persuasive and looks good, it's a great thing, Kind
of curious to see what they'd look like physically because, I'm using such cheap software. But at the same time, Twitter always downgrades the images anyway. So something to me that when it's on Pages, it looks like a really clear kind of gradient suddenly has these weird tube-like lines, which, I mean, they look neat too, but it's not exactly what I thought. I was like, what the hell did all these weird sort of tubes come from? Or these strange little jittery lines? What's it look like when I print it? I imagine, though, a decent printer would just sort of take the gradient. I mean, the nice thing about digital files is I can make the file as big as I want it to be, and the larger the file, the smoother the gradient and the clearer the color. So, but then again, cool. I'm also using Pages, which is it's a nice little word processor, but it's hardly anything that's designed to make images really pop on the page. But then again, that is maybe part of the aesthetic. Maybe I can work with that.
Yeah, and another thing, like one of my secrets, so to speak, of making things physical is, say, when I do screenshots, say, of art history pieces, like in the Related Images series, what I'll do is I'll recreate those images in Photoshop in a large format. Like that took me 2 years to figure out, that's how I can do this. Because otherwise I was working on an iPhone 6S, which is like 700 pixel width, right? So you try and print that big and it looks like shit. And so I figured out, I'll just recreate it. And then it felt like I was violating a kind of rule of some kind that, does this make it less authentic? but it's actually kind of, I'm simulating now the thing that was on the phone, and this kind of it adds actually an element of artificiality that I actually kind of like, because now if I was to, let's say I just put no fills on top and I just did a large scale version of a screenshot that's, say, like, a meter by 2 meters or whatever it is, it starts to look surreal because you've actually never seen it in high res like that. And when you actually come face to face with that work of art or that screenshot, it actually kind of captures you a little bit.
Oh, that's interesting.
So the reason I tell this story is I would say don't let the artificiality thing stop you from putting that thing into Photoshop and recreating it.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Because then it's like, and ever since I came to that insight, I say I use my phone as a compositional tool, but it's not like it's, in a sense, I do the mastering on the MacBook, but it's that sort of idea. So you could do the same thing. You could use your Microsoft Word really as a compositional tool, and then you bring it into Photoshop, and all of a sudden you do these super high res versions, and all of a sudden it's like, then it really gets crazy, right? Because then all of a sudden you're making these huge versions of these Microsoft Word things that are high res and don't have any of these little distortions. It gets interesting, right?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, because one of the things I like, just personally, I like the way I've figured out how to layer images to make them kind of glow and jump out of the screen occasionally.
Yeah, I see it. I'm actually on your Twitter feed and I see your profile image, and yeah, that circle in the middle like that.
Yeah. They kind of jump out. And when I was doing the larger things, like the weird one with the tree that was all kind of geometric and sort of alien looking, I was just layering thing over thing over thing and placing just really basic kind of shadow effects. And it made everything look, on my screen anyway, it made it kind of jump out a little bit, and some of the other things that I was doing where I had layers of grays and there'd just be a slight little beam of light, and so I kind of like that effect. And if I can enhance that and make it more high resolution, that'd be great.
Yeah, like I would get a copy of Photoshop and start doing some experiments. And because the cool thing about what you're doing in Microsoft Word is, like, the tool really it's so limited in its capacity, although maybe not that limited because you're actually doing quite a bit of stuff with it. But that's a kind of freedom in itself to be, because if you can start to make interesting things, which you have using just Microsoft Word, then you bring the high res stuff into it. Yeah, it just becomes original. Yeah, because I don't know anybody else that's using Microsoft Word as a compositional tool.
And I mean, that's just me not knowing how to use any kind of image, any sort of Photoshop or any paint program. Kind of like how I used to do recordings by patching a couple of Walkman together and getting these weird layered, murky kind of ambient drone things. And it was like, well, I would just record them on Walkmans. Or how I figured out how to hold a button on my old stereo just the right way so I could kind of get two channels at the same time and have everything kind of flicker and sort of layer on a cassette tape. I just simply don't know anything about the tech I'm using, so I just sort of screw around.
Yeah, sometimes that works to your advantage. I mean, you could take all the classes in the world and all of a sudden some of these guys, they take like a music engineering course and then they never end up making music ever again,
Yeah.
Okay, well, anything else? So you're just preparing your class, enjoying your summer, staying close to home. That's pretty much the update, I guess, eh?
Yeah, and getting ready to lecture or record lectures. I've got it's kind of an interesting class, actually. I've laid the groundwork for it. It's an introductory English class that involves studying scientific literature. So we have stuff. I teach stuff that's scientifically based, not always science fiction, but there's a little bit of SF. But I do teach texts that are science, that tend towards a kind of scientific viewpoint.
Yeah, science-oriented, maybe.
Carl Sagan, for example. There's an Ursula K. Le Guin story about animal intelligence. I might actually throw that thing about fruit bats that I read the other day into the class. Stuff about artificial intelligence and stuff. I've got a novel that is an SF novel written by a Saskatchewan writer who's a Cree lawyer it deals with it deals with an environmental collapse that makes everybody have to move into L'Orange because that's the coolest area. And so L'Orange is this gigantic urban sort of dwelling where the lower
hilarious.
It's got different tiers, and sort of the lower levels of L'Orange are sort of slum zones, and people actually have they figured out ways to have sort of like elevated platform cities so they can kind of escape the urban sprawl and the slum that's on the ground. And it's largely about a lawyer and a few other people. And the lawyer is kind of questioning his life, and he ends up getting an organic recreational vehicle that is a bio-cybernetic vehicle. They're growing these flying machines using bird DNA and cybernetics. And so he gets it to kind of escape on the weekends and fly around and kind of interface with it. And they develop a bit of a bond. Because it starts to be, by the end of the novel, it starts to become more intelligent, and they start to become kind of one. It's sort of a spiritual, but almost maybe even possibly eventually in a literal way. It's really an interesting novel, and again, science comes back into this little interview here.
Yeah, it really is. I want to call it such an important narrative, science, because it's actually grounded in something real. So it just makes it inherently maybe a little bit more interesting, and maybe more important than interesting. It makes it a little more relevant to our lives. Like it makes it a little bit more just important. Ballard always, I was like, oh, am I going to have to mention Ballard? there is a question that's been lurking at the back of my mind actually before we go, which is, and I'll probably ask you this more than one, but what's your sense now of Ballard? Like, he's been dead for 13 years, J.G. Ballard. I think it's about 13 years. Maybe it was 2009. He's been over a decade.
Yeah.
I don't know, is there 10 years later, what do you think it seems like the legacy is growing. Like, there's a lot of students that seem to like Ballard. It seems like he's gotten kind of, after he's died, he's become a bit hipper among a wider audience of people that are in academia. You get that impression as well?
I think that's true, and I think that'll work against him in the end. It's going to get the wrong kind of attention.
Well, he always hated the overstated, kind of really overwritten critical theory. I dug up in my research. As you know, I wrote my master's thesis on Ballard and the Atrocity Exhibition, and I found this thing buried in a science fiction journal where I'm sure I showed that to you, where he replied, or where he just trashed all the sort of postmodern things and postmodernism. And I don't think he loved Baudrillard. So I don't think his beef was with postmodernism per se. I think his beef was with a lot of the writing about postmodernism. Yeah. And they were starting to apply their sort of, almost like we were talking about earlier, we were talking about the difference between just reality and this world of hyperreal and of persuasion and of narrative. And I think ultimately the problem is, they were too obscure, and Ballard always, I think, prided himself on his clarity because he actually had something to say that was quite avant-garde, and we can get into that in another sort of conversation. It's probably worth it. And so I think he wanted to communicate that. And he felt like he had a lot of original good ideas. And so for him, clarity was paramount. And so that kind of flies in the face of this whole critical theory, the overwritten stuff. It's not all bad. Again, he liked the speculative stuff from Baudrillard. They call him one of the most important thinkers of the last 20 years and all that. So that's my take.
Like Jarry, and Jarry's hardly clear, but at the same time, Jarry's still approachable. Dali is a weirdo, and he's always playing a bit of a game with you, but he's still approachable.
Absolutely. Very accessible.
Freud has some really strange theories that got disproven, some of which got disproven throughout, well before Ballard was even writing. But Freud is approachable. And Freud, even at his weirdest, can be read as a metaphorical analysis. Like if you don't want to take Freud literally, and maybe you probably shouldn't take everything Freud says literally, you can still take him as a kind of insightful metaphor for a situation that's comprehensible. You can understand what Freud's talking about, even if it might be strange to you. And Baudrillard does get into the excessively obscure sometimes. But even then, sometimes, even when he's at his weirdest, once you figure out what Baudrillard's talking about, it all makes sense, in a kind of Jarry pataphysical way. There's a logic to it, and it's a playful kind of scientific logic where he's using science as a kind of metaphor to discuss things. So, I mean, it's weird writing. It may be counterintuitive and in some cases sort of bizarre and fucked up. But once you get the skeleton key to it, it makes sense. And it's not that difficult to get the skeleton key. It's not too difficult to figure this stuff out. Some of the other stuff that comes later, though, like
the way
that are just utterly obscure. Even Derrida. I mean, I like him because he throws monkey wrenches in things. But I mean, even he gets so obscure and strange that after a while it's frustrating. And yeah, I understand what Derrida's on about, so I got the skeleton key and I can understand him. But then he gets into his sort of deconstructing himself and all of his wordplay, and it becomes stuff that you can largely skip because he's just turning his own lens onto himself and he's being obscure to show how language can become obscure. And then he does it for 100 more pages.
Yeah.
So I can see why Ballard would get sick of that. And Derrida is at least self-aware, and he's aware of the fact that he's just kind of messing everything up, and he's kind of wrecking discourse and wrecking his own discourse, and he's not taking himself as seriously as as all of his children have.
That's right. Like in Derrida's defense, at least it's intentional.
Yeah.
Like it's not like, whereas. And what I was going to say about, say, guys like Freud and Baudrillard, and I think you could even say Derrida and as well as Ballard, these things their writings are based on very simple ideas.
Yeah.
Like very like Freud, okay, there's an ego, a super ego, and an id, and it gets more complicated from there.
Yeah.
But it's like you can go, okay, there's an unconscious. These are very simple ideas. Same with Baudrillard even. I think most people, are going to, with a little bit of reading, are going to kind of, with a little bit of critical analysis of the media, are going to understand what Baudrillard's talking about with the hyperreal. Mm-hmm. And this thing that's kind of this world that's kind of become disconnected from reality, because that kind of is our reality into this virus king. Like it seemed like the triumph. We have the hyperreal president, really. Yeah. And he's been sort of dumbfounded by this whole virus because it's like he thought the rules were all hyperreal and narrative is everything. I mean, that's how he runs this thing. And this virus, in some respects, has humiliated him because of he's trying to run this hyperreal show when the real has shown up, has reappeared at the party. So. Well, good. Okay. Well, maybe let's just leave it there, and let's check in sometime soon. It's great to hear from you.
Take care. See you later.
All right. Bye. You too.
Bye.
And there you have it. My interview with Brian Cotts. I hope you enjoyed it. That is just one of hopefully many to come. And with that, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, feel free to share it with your friends. Share it online. And if you want to find what I'm up to, you can always go to @Pocobelli on Instagram or go to pocobelli.net. We're going to have some prints available soon, so that's also exciting. Thank you once again for listening. And until next time, I'm Adrian Pocobelli.